There's a region of eastern France known as Franche-Comté. It's near the Swiss border in the foothills of the Jura Mountains. And down in a valley, there's an overgrown village called Ornans. The village is squeezed along the banks of the river Loup. It's one of those enchanting backwaters of French life which seems to have resisted nearly all change throughout the centuries. You might think nothing had ever happened here. And yet in the early part of the 19th century, Franche-Comté was known for a fierce loyalty to the principles of the French Revolution. And here in Ornans, in 1819, a man was born who was a revolutionary, in politics and in art. For me, he was the father of modern painting. This film is about a man who was big enough to stand in the firing line on two fronts. He was Gustave Courbet. All his life, Courbet expressed his views with uncompromising directness.
In our oh-so-civilized society, it is necessary for me to lead the life of a savage. I must free myself, even from governments. My sympathies are with the people. I must speak to them directly, so that I may draw my knowledge from them, and they give me life.
Courbet was born into times of tremendous political upheaval all over Europe. The generation before had already lived through two revolutions in France, 1789 and 1830. Then, when Courbet was 19, another revolution, 1848. Courbet was working in Paris at the time and got caught up in it all. He was a socialist and, as he saw himself, a man of the barricades. Art, as far as Courbet was concerned, would have to be about events now, about us. He was rooted in the upheavals of his time. And he was rooted in the countryside. Courbet's family were small farmers and landowners, peasants a few generations back. Courbet was brought up on the land. His friends were villagers, and he kept a thick country accent all his life. The people of Franche-Comté were staunch Republicans, no great respecters of Paris and central authority. Courbet began by painting the people he was brought up with. He painted his Republican grandfather, who gave Courbet his life's motto, shout loud and march straight. And he painted his youngest sister, Juliette. And his father, enjoying a glass of wine at a friend's house. After dinner at Ornans, the picture's called. It was bought by the state. "He has arrived without precedent," exclaimed Delacroix, the greatest painter of the day, and called him a revolutionary. So did Delacroix's rival, Ingres, but Ingres didn't approve. It's hard to see why from this picture, but he thought Courbet would be a dangerous example. It's easier to see why from the picture called The Stonebreakers. This looks a bit more like provocative socialism. "The nation is in danger," one Paris critic wrote. "His painting is an engine of revolution." But then anything was considered dangerous if it didn't conform to the polite standards of the Paris Salon, where a young artist's reputation could be made or broken. It was the only marketplace, and the market tended to echo the political climate. After all the revolutionary upheavals of the 1840s, there was now a sharp political swing to the right. Courbet had made his assault on Paris in more liberal days, but now the road began to look blocked. It was 1850. He was 31. He'd already been marked down as a man of promise, but now he needed to do something that was totally modern. and yet on the scale of the old masters, something that would establish him as the Veronese, the Rembrandt, the Rubens of his own day. He'd be a hero and change the course of art at a stroke. And that meant choosing a theme from his own time. And he found his inspiration here in his native Ornans, in the local cemetery. It's the burial of a villager, possibly his own grandfather, nobody's quite sure. At any rate, it's a painting about a village in mourning, a personal picture about grief, against a backcloth of Courbet's native hills. And it's huge, 23 feet long. Courbet was making a bid for fame with a picture on the scale of a historical pageant of kings and popes. Except that it's not. It's about village people. You could say that modern art begins here, with a panorama of modern life. Here's his mother. His three sisters weeping. Two local veterans of the French Revolution. The village priest looking sanctimonious. Courbet was no lover of the church. The beadles, in their scarlet finery, brought out of the fields for the occasion, via the local bar. The pallbearers averting their noses from the smell of the corpse. The gravedigger, looking as proud as a prince. Courbet has observed it all so well, like Dickens, like Balzac. No frills, life and death.
I am not only a socialist, but also a Democrat and a Republican, and above all, a realist. That is, a sincere friend of the real truth.
But the real truth was not what art was supposed to be about in 1850, and Courbet's reception in Paris was hostile. One critic wrote, "One has never seen and never could see anything so frightful. Good God, how ugly it is." Cartoons and caricatures filled the French press. I cannot believe it was simply because Courbet treated a theme from contemporary life. There had been realism in art before. Was it not because Courbet was showing that ordinary people, villagers, had feelings like anybody else? And if they had feelings like anybody else, were they not just as good as anybody else? Just as noble, and therefore to the bourgeois art public, dangerous even? How penetrating these studies of faces are. They refer back to Rembrandt and forward to Manet, to Cézanne, and to the young Picasso. The Parisians were shocked and disturbed by it, and Courbet widely attacked. He was a gift to the caricaturists. Mind you, he revelled in the notoriety. Courbet was a natural exhibitionist, and he loved holding court. He was proud of his looks, and he was proud of his opinions. In his favorite Paris café, he became the talk of the town. One of his friends said he held forth on all the arts, all the sciences, even those he knew nothing about. Great was the number of Parisians attracted to this manger where, they were told, a new god had been born. It was typical of the man that when briefly persuaded to set up his own teaching academy, Courbet introduced as a model for his pupils to draw a live bull. An artist who could not draw meat could not be expected to draw man. Courbet, you may be sure, saw himself as a bull in the china shop of French manners. And yet, in this new Paris bohemia, Courbet was the least crude of painters. Look at some of his portraits. a friend by the name of Nodler. A Spanish girlfriend. A fellow member of Paris Bohemia, the poet Baudelaire. And another celebrity who was not his friend, the composer Berlioz. Courbet would insist on singing country airs, appallingly out of tune all through the sitting. And a marvellous portrait of a homely Parisian woman called Euphrasie. She was the wife of a friend who influenced Courbet more profoundly than any man outside his family. He was Pierre Proudhon, whom Courbet also painted, with his children. Proudhon was a self-educated man from Courbet's own Franche-Comté, deeply learned and a radical philosopher, the founder of anarchism. Proudhon held all governments and authorities in contempt. He loathed power and the acquisition of property. Property is theft, he wrote. Proudhon spent much of his life in exile or jail. He was jailed, in fact, for predicting that the new French president, Louis Napoleon, would stage a coup d'etat and make himself emperor, which is exactly what he did in 1851. Another damned emperor, another Napoleon. Puny echoes of imperial glory. This was not a climate in which realism was likely to find official favor. Proudhon was in prison, and the police began to keep an eye on Courbet. But for the next 20 years, Courbet kept clear of politics, nor did he paint political themes. He was not Proudhon. Realism to Courbet didn't mean preaching an ideology through his work. It meant, quite simply, recording life as he saw it. His three sisters giving arms to a cowgirl. A wonderfully fresh piece of open-air painting which directly anticipates the work of the young Impressionists. This is where Courbet was a true revolutionary. One can't imagine a scene uglier, more deserted, less agreeable, one critic wrote. The girls so lacking in charms, so ungraceful, with such a common air, so badly dressed. Again, two of his sisters, working, not posing, the winnowers. To me, this is the loveliest of all Courbet's paintings. The newspapers couldn't see it. His other sister, fallen asleep, spinning. All the critics could say was that the girl was filthy and needed a good wash. And yet when Courbet showed them a girl who'd just had a good wash, the critics screamed even louder. She was a Hottentot Venus, and Courbet the Antichrist of physical and moral beauty. Peasants, they seem to suggest, all right if you must, but at least let them be clean and well dressed, not fat and naked and, God save us, desirable. Napoleon III was so furious when he toured the Paris Salon that he struck the painting with his riding crop. Courbet used to get away from it all for long periods in his native Ornans. In Paris, he had swilled beer and held court in left-bank cafes, led the fashionable bohemian life. But here in the countryside lay the other side of Courbet. He hunted and fished and walked, became a peasant again. He even disliked calling himself an artist, preferring the title master painter, like master carpenter or master mason. Courbet brought to French art a new ruralism. Landscape was no longer just a pretty background.
There are a lot of idiots who think you can do a landscape just like that. They pack a few things together and set off for some country or other. Well, that's just a joke. To paint a country, you have to know it. I know my country, and I paint it.
Landscape was very much a mirror of Courbet's own feelings, and his favourite mirror was the theme of water. It's a persistent life symbol in Courbet's work. His landscapes are a record of Courbet's affections, of his own life, and travels in this region he loved. Franche-Comté is a great hunting country, and Courbet, like everybody else, loved hunting. He would go out for days with his gun and his painting things. What makes him so sensitive an observer of animals is the fact that he was a countryman. He didn't paint animals in zoos, he painted them exactly as he saw them in the wild, in his native forests. No artist has understood better than Courbet the huntsman's ambivalent feelings towards the creature he hunts. No artist painted winter with such a sense of being out in it. There's no celebration of blood sports here, not like an English hunting picture at all. Realism again. Perhaps Courbet's greatest hunting picture is this one. It's a still life, a hunting scene, and an elegant picnic all in one. Once again, it makes me think of those sumptuous open-air pictures of Monet and Renoir, 10, 20 years later. By the age of 35, Courbet had achieved a good deal of fame, but it was not enough. Now he desperately needed a patron, someone with money and taste who would take him as he was and back him.
I hope to live by my art all my life, without ever deviating by a fraction from my principles, without lying to my conscience for a single instance, without ever painting a picture, even as big as my hand, to please anyone whatever, or to ensure its sale. Have no fear. Though I might have to search all over the world, I am sure to find men who will understand me.
And in 1854, there appeared on the scene a patron who was rich enough and aloof enough not to give a damn about Courbet's reputation as a wild man. And this patron stepped forward and bought the very painting that Napoleon III had struck with a riding crop. And then he invited the artist to come and stay with him for as long as he liked. He was Alfred Bruyas, a banker's son from Montpellier in the south, and he was the savior Courbet was looking for. In May 1854, Courbet traveled south for a 4-month stay with Bruyas, and he recorded his first encounter with characteristic flourish. Here was a historic moment. Courbet believed that an artist should paint today's events because they would be tomorrow's history. So he painted himself with his new patron at his service, lackey in attendance. And behind them you can just see a coach waiting to drive him to fame and a golden future. The critics found the picture intolerably conceited, but that no longer mattered.
I am growing more and more certain that I'll triumph, for there are two of us. With your background, your intelligence, your courage, and your financial resources, you can rescue us while we're alive and enable us to save a century of time.
The support of Bruyas was a terrific boost to Courbet, and returning to Ornans, he determined to paint another massive canvas which would reaffirm to the world the steadfastness of his career as an artist so far. And what better arena for a fresh tilt at the art world than the Paris Universal Exhibition of 1855, the great trade fair of arts and sciences, which was to be the French response to the 1851 exhibition in London. And what theme could be more appropriate to show the world than the artist himself at work at the heart of his own world?
Interior of my studio, a truthful allegory, resolving a phase of 7 years of my life as an artist. The scene set in my Paris studio. I'm in the center, painting, showing the Assyrian profile of my head. On the right are all the active participants. That is, my friends, the workers, the art collectors.
Bruyas is prominent in the front rank of admirers. Near him, Proudhon, just out of jail. On the right, another socialist friend, the writer Max Buchon, still in exile, a wanted man. It was provocative and brave of Courbet, foolhardy perhaps, to include these men in a bid for public acclaim. Then Champfleury, one of Courbet's few champions in the press, though not for long. He didn't like this picture, certainly not this portrait. Behind Champfleury, a pair of lovers, a pair of art lovers, and the poet Baudelaire, also a friend and defender, though he didn't like the picture either. At Baudelaire's request, Courbet painted out a portrait of the poet's black mistress, Jeanne Duval. The group on the left consists of people outside Courbet's world, an assortment of characters he'd seen on his travels and people he despised. In the foreground, a poacher, a thinly disguised portrait of Napoleon III, who had poached the French Republic. This was asking for trouble. No wonder he had his doubts about the picture's reception.
The critics who attempt to judge this will have their hands full. They'll have to make what they can of it. For there are people who wake up in the night shouting, "I want to judge, I want to judge."
And how right Courbet was. The picture was rejected. So Courbet decided to award himself the palm, and with Bruyas's money, he defiantly mounted his own temporary exhibition in a specially erected pavilion near the official one. He believed he'd make his fortune, but it was an expensive flop. The studio never sold in his lifetime. It was Courbet's last blockbuster, his last attempt to take fame by storm. It's easy now to ask what was so offensive about the studio. It's a fairly traditional theme, the artist contemplating the process of art. Two of the greatest European painters had created masterpieces on precisely the same theme. Vermeer, a painter in his studio, and Velázquez, Las Meninas. But Vermeer and Velázquez had played down the autobiographical element. The artist viewed from behind or in a mirror, whereas Courbet emphasized it. He is in the center of the stage. His hand is raised to add the master touch. His face is tilted to catch the light. He's holding court again. Amid all this crowd of friends and enemies surrounding the artist, there are two other significant figures in this painting. One is a ragged little boy in clogs gazing up at the artist in curiosity and, naturally, adoration. He may or may not be Courbet's own son, then aged about 7. He'd had an illegitimate child by a rather older woman who left him in 1851, taking the boy with her. More particularly, I think, the child is an embodiment of Courbet's hopes for the fresh young generation which would appreciate his genius and perhaps bring about the social revolution he urged. And then there's the woman, very much more central to Courbet's life. We don't know who she is, but she represents Courbet's favorite piece of human furniture. She's the model mistress figure, attentive, obedient, passive, waiting to be needed. She hides one breast, the more to emphasize the other. Courbet is one of the great painters of the nude. There's no nonsense about moral beauty. These are paintings about pleasure, sensuality. Great haunches and buttocks, you can almost hear the sound of Courbet's hands slapping them. And yet the gestures are always delicate and graceful. Generally, Courbet's nudes adopt the self-conscious poses of classical nudes and 1,001 Renaissance Venuses and Dianas. Only Courbet stripped them of their mythological disguises and offered them as women of his day.
A woman is a bird of passage who settles for a certain time in your place. Love is born to run through the world, not to install itself in households like an old domestic. And the artist who marries isn't an artist. He's a sort of jealous proprietor.
Courbet created his own mythology of women. It's the myth which today has become debased as the centerfold blonde, the pin-up. The myth of woman luxuriating in her nakedness, making us voyeurs. Courbet cannot show lovemaking, But sleep is frequently a metaphor for sexual fulfillment. He cannot show a man and woman making love, but the classical precedent of themes like Venus and Psyche licensed him to depict two women naked together. Courbet was not always sensual. Some of his women are described with Victorian sweetness. Two women on the banks of the River Seine in summer. And in the background, water again. Water. It seems to flow through Courbet's life, from the source to the sea. His first encounter with the Mediterranean he recorded characteristically as a historic occasion.
Oh, see, your voice is tremendous, but it will never succeed in drowning the voice of fame as it shouts my name to the whole world.
The coast of Normandy. It was here in 1859 that he met another painter of the sea, Eugène Boudin. And Boudin took Courbet to his native town, the old fishing port of Honfleur. Honfleur was already something of an artist's colony. The mussels were good, accommodation cheap, and it looked pretty. There was nothing smart about it, and there was plenty of local colour. Boudin installed his new friend in an old farmhouse called the Ferme Saint-Siméon, just outside Honfleur. The farmer's wife offered cheap lodgings to people she liked, and she liked artists. The farm had a view over the estuary of the Seine, and a short distance away was the open sea. Courbet used to go painting along the coast with Boudin, and later with a much younger local artist, Claude Monet. Courbet is among the greatest of all painters of the sea. It was everything that appealed to him most strongly in nature, and it stirred his soul. As he grew wealthier and grander in the 1860s, he stayed not in a humble farmhouse anymore, but in the smarter resorts of the Norman coast, Trouville, Deauville, and the splendid villa of the Comte de Choiseul. And here, too, he held court.
Here I am, living in an earthly paradise. There are 6 servants to wait on us. The table is laden with dishes and cutlery of chased silver. In the middle of the table is a basket of flowers. At each corner of the basket, a bowl of magnificent fruit. I have received more than 2,000 ladies in my studio, all wanting to have their portraits done. In 1 month, I have painted 35 canvases, which astonished everyone, and bathed 80 times.
Courbet's work had once been called an engine of revolution. Well, the engine had acquired some luxury fittings. These were the rich years. So did Courbet sell out? What does that mean? He was true to himself. He may have been a political revolutionary, but at the same time he had a huge appetite for living. And his paintings expound a new faith, loud and clear, the spirituality of enjoyment. Courbet is the great hedonist of 19th century art. He's the Falstaff of painting. But he's Falstaff in action. For instance, in 1870, the French government, making amends for past ignoring of his talent, offered him this. It's the Légion d'honneur, one of the highest awards in the land. It's the knighthood, if you like, or more. And Courbet refused it. And not only did he refused it very loud so that everyone would know, and everyone would know why. He did not like governments and would not receive any awards from them. Well, people who sell out don't do that. He had never ceased making rude gestures at authority. A few years earlier, he had painted Return from the Conference. This was an attack on the clergy considered then scurrilous. It was refused even for the Salon des Refusés, a unique achievement. The picture hasn't survived because some pious cleric bought it, crossed himself, and slashed it to pieces. And even while indulging in the good life of Deauville, Courbet kept one ear to the popular rumblings in Paris. Within 2 years, he was a member of the International Working Men's Association and appeared for the first time on police records. The revolutionary in Courbet is a debt to his friend, the anarchist philosopher Proudhon. Now, as a political thinker, Proudhon has been overshadowed by his great rival Karl Marx. Yet as an influence on art, Proudhon remains far more important than Marx, because for better or worse, the main thread of art over the past 100 years has been anarchist. And this is a huge debt to Proudhon and to Courbet, who learnt from him. Modern art has insisted on the primacy of the individual in contempt of state authority. In 1870, France declared war on Germany. The Franco-Prussian War followed. A disaster for France. Reality at last pricked the bubble of Napoleon III's little empire. He had to bow to Bismarck, was taken prisoner, and the Third Republic was proclaimed. But the Parisians decided to take the future into their own hands. A rebellion established a people's commune in Paris, which Karl Marx hailed as the first great proletarian uprising against the bourgeoisie. Many artists fled, not Courbet. His old anarchism surfaced white hot, and he threw himself back into politics. He was elected a deputy, a communard. He became president of the General Assembly of Artists and curator of fine arts, with special responsibility for safeguarding Paris museums and works of art.
I have fought against all forms of governmental and divine right, wanting man to govern by himself. Let us now set up a completely new order of things. The painters at my instigation have just taken such an initiative.
Courbet's initiative was to lend his weight to the proposal for removing the column in the Place Vendôme put up in honor of Napoleon I. It was a copy of the great column in Rome celebrating the conquests of the Emperor Trajan. To the Paris Communard, the Vendôme column was a hated symbol of imperial oppression, and Napoleon, not the hero of his people, but a betrayer of the French Revolution. Courbet hated all Napoleons. On May the 16th, 1871, the column was duly pulled down, and Napoleon lay in the dust. Courbet was a witness. To friends who were with him, he observed,
"It'll wipe me out in falling. You'll see."
it did. There's always been dispute as to how responsible Courbet really was. He claimed afterwards that the decision was made over his head, but in the public's mind there was no doubt about it. It was Courbet's doing. Within a week, the government forces swept into Paris from Versailles, where they had been recouping. They took a savage revenge. Courbet went into hiding to avoid the mass arrests and the slaughter. But he was caught, taken to prison in chains, tried, found guilty, and given a jail sentence of remarkably only 9 months in all. He might well have lost his life. Now Courbet was everywhere abused. His rich patrons deserted him. Alexandre Dumas the younger wrote, "What fabulous intercourse between a slug and a peacock could have spawned a thing called Monsieur Gustave Courbet." Courbet sketched a prison scene of communards awaiting trial. After a while, Courbet was allowed to paint, but only what he could find to paint in his cell, such as the fruit which one of his sisters sent. And he painted himself in jail, pretending to be youthful and debonair instead of the sick man in his 50s, which he was.
My dear Boudin, I am all the more glad to have received your charming letter, because these times are rife with cowards. Now, you can make a pilgrimage to see a man who has just completed 7 months of solitary confinement, which is no laughing matter. That's all the reward I got for service rendered, and for the good I wanted to do. After escaping the eager firing squads they intended for me, I have decided to undergo an operation which may achieve what the firing squads missed.
The operation was nasty, but hardly grave, for piles. On his release from prison, Courbet returned to Ornans, broken in health and in spirit. But he wasn't off the hook. Within 18 months, he was on the move again, driven by the news that the government was after him for the entire cost of replacing the Vendôme column. Courbet got out while he could. He fled to Switzerland, Lake Geneva. And then he settled in a little fishing town called La Tour de Paix, with an exile's view westwards towards his native mountains, the Jura. It was a pleasant enough place. He could be inconspicuous here. He was grateful, and he showed it with this gift to the town, liberty. He leased a house on the harbour, formerly an inn and fisherman's cottage, only 1 story high then. Courbet began to paint again. Back in France, the French court settled Courbet's fine at 323,000 francs, millions in today's money. He could pay it in installments of 10,000 francs a year, which meant he'd be 91 by the time he paid it off. He gave up all hope of going back, and when he couldn't bear the loneliness, he went to the local cafe. Here he is with some of the locals. What must it have been like for Courbet? He was an exile, he was a bankrupt, and he was alone. Now this for a man who loved his native region of France as much as Courbet did, who was tremendously ambitious, and who had always been the center of attention. I think it must have been a kind of slow death. And so increasingly, while his assistants were down in the studio prettying up the pictures, Courbet spent more and more of his time here in this cafe, drinking. Well, now, he'd always drunk, and always drunk heavily. But now it was supposed to be 12 liters of wine a day. That's 12 of these, plus spirits. By the time he got here, he had cirrhosis of the liver, and now this developed into dropsy. Dropsy is a very nasty condition in which fluids collect in the tissues of the body and blow you out as if your entire skin were a bladder. Courbet had a 60-inch waistline, and doctors had to drain fluid off him, 20 liters at a time. This is the last photograph taken of him. Courbet died on the last day of 1877, just over 100 years ago. He was 58. One of his last paintings was of a dead doe hung on a hook, bleeding. Courbet the hunter died in exile, the hunted. In retrospect, Courbet the man seems larger than life in everything he did. As a painter, too, he was larger than those around him. At the beginning of this film, I made a claim that Courbet was the father of modern painting. And this may seem rather a wild claim. And if I'm to sum up what I mean, I think I'd say that, apart from being a very great painter, Courbet was also the prototype of a kind of painter we now take for granted. A man who considered it to be his born right to be free of any kind of official demands. He was not a public servant, and he was not fashion's slave. Courbet was the first artist to insist that his own experience of life, as he saw it, was the main business of art. Gustave Courbet was the first artist to say effectively, art is what I do.
It is not the thing I paint that is important. It is what I put of myself into what I paint. When I am dead, let this be said of me. He belonged to no school, no church, no institution, no academy, least of all to any regime, but the regime of liberty.